Good morning, afternoon, wherever you are in the world. I'm not sure what time zones we are busy dealing with here, but there might be a couple of them. So good morning. My name is Jan Meiberg. I'm a Microsoft technical trainer with Microsoft here in the UK. We are busy with a series around RAG with the Azure Open AI service. So this is session number 2 out of that series. I'm going to do a brief introduction quickly, and then we will continue with our content. Just from a Microsoft Reactor perspective, thanks for the Microsoft Reactor folks for hosting these sessions. Of course, as per usual, be friendly, be patient, be respectful, but we want you to ask questions and interact as much as possible. We don't want this to be a one-way communication predominantly, right? So let's get going, folks. What is on our agenda? So first of all, we're going to do a bit of a recap about what we spoke about. What is this RAG thing that we are talking about? So a brief overview of that. And then we will delve into the second component, and the second component that we'll chat about. Last week, we spoke about open AI and prompt engineering. So we kind of have that under the belt. This week, we are going to talk about Azure Search. And the reason we have to do this is if you want to do retrieval augmented generation, or RAG as it's called, then you're going to be using OpenAI, our OpenAI services, but you're also going to use something like Azure Search, which gives you the ability to integrate, these two components. Anyway, so then we'll talk a little bit about what is Azure Search. We'll talk about what the different components are that make up the Azure Search service, right? What are the building blocks? And it's actually relatively straightforward, right? There's nothing complex about this service. And then further to that, we will look at the process, right? Essentially what we're building is we're building a bit of a pipeline where we can enrich the data. And we enrich the data by using what's known as skill sets, right? We'll also talk a little bit about debugging and then see if there are questions towards the end. So I hope that we're kind of all on the same page here. Anyway, as promised, a bit of a recap here. The series we're talking about regarding RAG is essentially, you'll see that this is a very nice sort of diagram where we refer to here are my data sources, and we'll talk about the data sources in a minute. And then, of course, we've got the Azure AI Search, which is going to be indexing some of those data sources. And then, of course, this information becomes available from the application because our Open AI service can interact with this search service, right? So if you want to do this retrieval augmented generation pattern, if you like, with our Azure services, you're at least going to need the OpenAI service, which we spoke about last week in our prompt engineering session. And it's crucial that you get that prompt engineering patterns right in your application, of course. However, you will also need something like Azure Search, because Azure Search is going to be indexing your corporate data, right? Indexing your corporate information. And that corporate information is going to get fed into this AI search service. And eventually the Open AI service is going to generate responses while it's busy looking at this information that sits in the index, right? So the Azure Search component is a big part of our RAG strategy at this point, if you want to call it that. So we've covered Open AI last week. Of course, we could probably spend a lot more time around prompt engineering and these sort of things, but I think we've kind of got those under the belt. All right. So this week we'll focus on Azure Search, just Azure Search, not talking about anything else. And then next week, it's going to be probably a little bit more exciting because next week for the final session of the series, we're going to then look at integrating these two services and how we can bring them together and how we can actually get this Open AI endpoint to interact with this AI service. And we'll see how the SDK and the API allows you to leverage the AI search when you're running queries against the OpenAI service. Okay, so this is just a broad overview of what this series is all about. Excuse me for a second, I need to cough. Great. So as promised, the next thing to talk about is what is Azure Search, and this is a busy slide. I don't really like to make busy slides like this, but it does summarize the Azure Search up quite nicely in one basic PowerPoint that shows you some of the capabilities and some of the supported formats. Right now, you'll see what I've done here is let's just quickly talk about the supported formats before we get to the left-hand side here. So Azure Search has got some supported formats, right? You can see, and there's a range of them. New Word documents, old Word format documents, JSON, KML, rich text, CSV, emails, etc., right? But if you want to integrate this with OpenAI, there's a couple of supported documents from the OpenAI interface that are supported, right? So be mindful of these. I do have a link somewhere where I can actually show some of this to you. And there is a date. No, that's not that. You can see here, and I believe that Rav has actually got this in, has got a short link for this. Should come up in the comments in a few seconds. But you'll see that essentially there's the data formats that are supported. And probably a little bit more importantly, you will see that if you want to do this RAG pattern with your OpenAI service, the data ingestion, your ability to address your own data, has to come from these supported services. Now you'll notice, if I just zoom in here quickly, you will see the first thing we support is we support Azure AI Search, right? We also support the uploading of files that's still in preview. However, you will still see that it still makes use of Azure AI Search, right? So, and in actual fact, Azure AI Search, the data sources that we can address with this tool is so vast that you would probably want to use Azure AI Search for a bunch of additional things, not just this RAG implementation, right? And then you can see we're also in preview. I've not seen this available in the interface yet, but we can also ingest, URLs using the Azure Blob service, right? And then you'll see that we can also have a blob store, but again, the blob store is essentially just going to talk to the Azure AI Search index. So the only one of these supported sources that doesn't require that is essentially a public storage account that we can essentially access via URLs. Okay, so be mindful of this. This is essentially some of these limitations that you might run into. Okay, so supported formats, supported data sources. Those links are all in there. And then let's take a look at what is Azure Search, right? So Azure Search is our cloud-based search component and service that allows you to do not only full text searches, in other words, text matching, right? Matching, if I'm searching for the word widget, which document had the word widget in? That sort of full text search, but also a vector search. Now, if you're not familiar with vector searches, vector searches are essentially searches that search for similarity based on numeric value that has been assigned to a piece of text or even something else like an image. I like to use my colleague who works for Microsoft as well, and also a friend of mine, Paul. I like to use Paul's analogy for this, because this is actually 100% what we're talking about when we're talking about these vectors. Let's say that I've got a graph, right? And don't worry about what these are, right? Because it could be kind of anything. But if I had to say I've got a green apple, right? And I've got a red apple. If we are searching for similarity on this scale that I've got, a red apple and a green apple are going to be quite close together, right? In fact, probably also one of these yellow apples, will be very close from a vector perspective because it's a very similar type of thing. But if I have to contrast this with let's say, for argument's sake, maybe some grapes, right? Can you see that with grapes, yes, it's also on the scale of being a fruit, but it's not close to an apple, right? These apples are closer together. So what vector search gives us is it gives us a type of number, like, for example, 525. Let's write that in. 525, for example, and this one might be 528. This one might be 521, for that matter, right? One of these vectors that have been assigned to my apple, or whatever the case is. Whereas my bunch of grapes might be something like a 280 or something. So vector searches allows me to search for similarity, not exact text matches. And of course, something like this is quite important when you're searching for meaning and not searching for exact matches, right? And then on top of that, we can also do what's known as hybrid search. And I know this sounds like it's actually a component that is built into our search capability. The reality is we've got a marketplace where we actually can show you what sources are available, and some of those sources might actually sit on premises, all right? So as long as we've got access, connectivity to whatever you're busy indexing, we can index that, right? So we support rich indexing. We support lexical analysis, the ability for us to take words with dashes, remove the dashes, and analyze that information. It uses the ADA model under the covers for that lexical analysis to also try to understand what this information is that we're busy indexing right now. Of course, as you can well imagine, we've got all the usual suspects from the Azure available here, right? You get your scale, you get your security, you get your reach as well. And we'll talk about the data sources in a few minutes. The reach is incredible, and really gives you quite a bit of value as far as I'm concerned. And then on top of the ability to index and search this information, we've also got the ability to enrich that data, right? So this is the ability for us to index the data and search the data, but also build a knowledge base around that data that augments our data and enriches our data using what's known as skill sets. We'll talk about that also a bit later. And then, of course, there's also integration into a bunch of other Azure services. For example, if you were using our Open AI playground and you were busy bringing your own data, it's going to point you there to our search service. So we've got integration into the search service, but it's not just the Open AI service that makes use of this. Even our Azure language service, if you enable things like custom questions and answering, it's actually going to use the Azure AI Search service that's actually going to be interacting and storing some of that information and providing context around that. So again, even though the search supports a wide variety of content, there's a bunch of supported formats that's available for the OpenAI service. The building blocks of our search service is an interesting one, because these are really just the components that make up the search service, right? So after I've provisioned one of these services, I will be able to go and create the index. I'll be able to go and point it to a data source. I'll be able to create an indexer. I'll be able to add some skill sets. Why do we use these different things? Well, it's all in the makeup of the service. So from a data source perspective, we will essentially add some data sources, and this is the data that we're planning to index, right? Now, this could be, as I mentioned, a variety of sources. But in fact, let me just show this to you quickly. I think that's kind of the easiest thing to do, right? So there's my always on search service, and I think it's worth just pointing it out there. So I've created this early on, and you'll see from a search management perspective, you will see that there's a bunch of options. The rest of these items are really just settings and rankings options. However, if I go to my data sources here, you'll notice that I can go and add a bunch of data sources. You can see there's some Cosmos DB data sources. There's a bunch of Azure Blob storage items. There's one that says to delete, probably in one of my AI course demos. But the reality is, if I click on the Add Data Source button here, you'll notice that I actually can point it to a variety of backend data sources, right? SQL, Cosmos DB, OneLake. And in actual fact, this is the tip of the iceberg. And I think this is where things get really exciting, because we've opened this up to a type of a gallery, if you like, right? Like a marketplace. So yes, there are the standard services that we can search with this service. But if I look and scroll down here a section, for example, you'll see that there's some additional options. Gosh, there's a SharePoint option, right? So setting this up is not as straightforward as setting it up for a storage account, for example. But there's some documentation that will essentially allow you to hook up your SharePoint content. So you point it to your SharePoint site, and it's going to start indexing that SharePoint site, right? And again, if I want you to take a look at the size of the scroll bar. And this should just give you some sort of an indication of what we've got. You'll see a variety of ECM systems here. Amazon S3, for example, Confluence Cloud, Azure Blobs, IntraID, Azure Data Lake, right? But you'll see there's Documentum, for example, one of those ECM systems, Drupal, right? All of these, in actual fact, even Elite E3, which is essentially an ERP type system. So there's lots of these data sources that are flowing into our service at this point in time, and I can only see this expanding, right? And this is where the true value lies of our search service. So we can go and index any of these platforms and add those to your RAG implementation, for that matter. Right, so pretty comprehensive. So that's essentially my data sources, and once I've got my data source, I can then optionally add a skill set. Right now, let's just take this out of the loop for 1 second. Right, let's just say that we're not planning to enrich the data. All I really need is the source data. I need an indexer, and I need an index. All right. The index is essentially a collection of different fields. All right. Collection of different fields. When we essentially start indexing the data, what the indexer will do is it will take the source fields, and it's essentially going to map those in pipeline and other pipeline outputs. We'll talk about the pipeline in a minute. And it's essentially going to map those fields to the index, right? So if I've got, for example, a Word document that has got an author, and the author is Johan Meiberg, then we might in the index create an author field, and then it'll show that document was authored by Johan Meiberg. All right. So what you want to first do is first understand what information you want from the source data, and then map those fields to an index, right? And in the index, you will specify which of these fields are going to be searchable, which of these fields can you use for filters, etc., right? So at the very, very least, in its most simple format, there's a data source, there's an indexer, and there's an index, and the indexer indexes the data and maps the data to the index and the matching fields that we've got in the index. Right. So that's in a very simple situation what it happens. However, I can just index the data if I wanted to, but probably what I want to do is I probably want to augment this data to a specific to a certain extent. And we do that with skill sets, right? So what we're really talking about here is we're talking about enriching our data from the source with some additional metadata. So what basically these skill sets and skills do is it shapes the data. So it might extract some additional metadata out of that. A good example of this is the ability for us to, for example, call into Azure AI services and let Azure AI services check what language the document is in. OCR some images, for example, right? And there's a variety of them. We'll touch on those a little bit later on. Okay, so you can either just index the data and search the data, or alternatively, you can index the data and during this process also enrich that data with these different skill sets. Now, we will talk about that in a bit more detail later on. All right. So these are essentially the building blocks. And from a skill set perspective, we've got different types of skill sets, right? The one is built-in skill sets. There's a variety of built-in skill sets, but nothing is stopping you from actually also building your own skill set, right? So these are really the building blocks that make up the search service. The indexing process is it follows these components, rightfully so as well, because if I look at my data sources here, of course, the indexer has to open up these documents, right? This is referred to as document cracking, right? So it cracks open these documents and then extracts the document, these different fields. For example, the document content, the document author. So if there's a content option there and there's an author option there, I would expect somewhere in my index for there to be a content field and somewhere in my index for there to be an author field, right? And that's essentially what the indexer does. Now, it might be that your source data contains all the information that you want. If the source data doesn't contain all the information you want and you want to enrich it, that's what you'll do through that enrichment pipeline, right? So this is where these skill sets actually come in. Now, again, keep in mind, we might be referring here to large documents for that matter, right? And some of our services on the AI side cannot cater for that, right? Our language detection service, the amount of text I can send in there is limited. I cannot send terabytes of text in there. So ideally, what you might need to do is essentially what's known as chunking, right? Or splitting up the source content into smaller chunks that I can use these chunks and send them off to the language service and get the result from that, right? And then there might be, out of this, there might be an additional field that is mapped to my, to my index, something like the language. What is the language of this document? And then in my index, there's also going to be a language on the document, and that indexer is going to populate that field for me automatically, right? So then that indexer is essentially optionally going to enrich the information and create a knowledge base around that. And then finally, once that index is populated, I can go and query that index. And in fact, I want to show some of these to you quickly. Let's start with a data source. We've already spoken about this. You can see there I can go and add a data source, for example, something like Azure Blob Storage. I can say that this is my, let's call this one the reactor search. Oopsie. And you can see that I need to specify something like a connection string. So let me just quickly pop out here and find a connection string. I'm going to use any one of these. Always static is most welcome. So let me just scroll down there. You can see that there's my storage account access keys, and there is my connection string. So I can copy that, and I can actually just paste that in there. Right, and you can see happy days. it wants to know if it must use something like a managed identity for the search service to interact with that storage account, right? If it was a SharePoint site, you will also typically have the SharePoint URL for the SharePoint site in here, but you will also use something like a user-assigned identity for that. And then I can specify the container name. I think I've got one there called website. Let me just quickly check. Just find the interesting one here. Yeah, there's one called website, right? And there's a couple of, say, some content in there. And then you can see I can specify the blob folder if I wanted to. I can also track deletions and these sort of things. You will see that we can also bring in a JSON definition if we wanted to, but I'm going to just save this one out, right? So now I've effectively, if I refresh this, I've got my reactor store here available. So I've got my source set up. Now what I need to do is I need to essentially create my index. I'm not going to create an index from scratch, though I will show you what this will look like. Again, most of these are configurable via a REST and JSON sort of configuration, but you'll see in the portal, we've essentially built something like this. Like, for example, the document ID, right? Do I want to filter on ID? Do I want to be able to sort? Do I want to use this as face table, which implies that I can essentially use this field to pivot my data? It's not really what I want to do there. And then you can also see whether it's searchable. So what I'll typically do is I'll typically add a content field, right? And you can see there it can be any one of these data types, and then I can specify it has to be retrievable, filterable, maybe not filterable if we're talking about the content, right? I'm never going to filter based on a large chunk of text. I'm always going to filter based on a short piece of text, right? So for example, the author name and those sort of things. So this is something that you'll have to flesh out quite nicely. Retrievable, filterable, sortable, and searchable, of course, right? And you can see that we can use all sorts of different types of analyzers for this, right? To actually go and index those fields. And then you'll see that there is essentially my, my index. So I can call this one the reactor, and I can go and hit the create button. Right, there's my reactor index now. Now the last thing I need to do is I essentially need to index this information, right? I'm not gonna worry about the enrichment now in this first go. I'll show that to you in a little bit. But what I did here is I created my data source. I created the index. Now it's time to go and create that indexer that's effectively going to marry these two together. So I'm going to click on add an indexer here, and you'll see that this is very straightforward. I can also call it reactor. Oopsie. Typos, maybe it's feels like Friday. So you can see all I have to do here is I have to point it to my data source, point it to my index, right? There's my index and my data source. You can see that I can optionally also point it to a skill set, right? I'll show that to you in a few minutes. I'm not going to point it to a skill set right now, but you can see there I can specify that this is going to run once, this is going to run hourly, daily, but I can also have a custom schedule, right? I can specify when I want this to run. You will see that we've got additional fields here, for example, batch sizes, these sort of things, and you can use some of these options to essentially configure how exactly it's going to do some of this indexing, right? You can see the parsing mode, use text, use a JSON array. You can see what happens if we find an image, right? If we find an image, generate normalized images, right? Generate a normalized image per page, these sort of things. And you can also see that that I can also use things like a PDF rotation algorithms and these sort of things, detecting the angles inside those options, right? So I'm going to save this one out. I'm not going to run it now. Well, I might quickly give it a run, but I would rather show you the other ones I've already ran. Okay, so that was just a very simple setting up the source, setting up the index, setting up the indexer. All right. Now all of this is also available via REST and JSON. And if you know where to find our hands-on labs for some of these services, you'll notice that our hands-on labs kind of takes you through the whole process. Remind me to also share the lab URL with you for this. I can definitely do that. All right, so let's talk now a little bit about this enrichment component, because this is really where the value comes in. We don't want you to just index this data and search the data, folks. That's not the real result that we're after here. We want to say, well, here's a bunch of documents we've indexed. This document is English, this one is Afrikaans, this one is in French. There's a bunch of images. This image contains all this text. This image this text is made up of these key phrases, right? There's other utilities in these skills that we can use that, for example, splits up your documents, right? Merges those chunks that we spoke about earlier on into single ones. Or alternatively, if these built-in options don't work for you, you can also create your own custom skills. So there is a custom skill component that you can essentially build out your own custom skills, and to that end, you might use something like our Azure Function Service to check for additional things. Maybe you are going to check for certain things in the text that relate to stock codes, right? And then you want to go to the backend ERP system and you want to check to see if that stock code has been superseded, right? And if it has been superseded, then flag this item as being superseded, right? And that will allow me to go and do some searches against the index to say, show me all the widgets that have been superseded, right? Show me the list of those items that were superseded. And that's really the idea here. So not only do we have some built-in skills, but we've also got some other frameworks that allows you to build your own custom skills, where you can build in your own business logic if you want, and augment your data and enrich your data using your own other types of data. Right, so that's that guy there. And then let me quickly just crack open a demo here for you. So what I've got here is I've got a couple of sources, right? So there's one data source. I've got one data source called Margie's knowledge data. Now, Margie's knowledge data, folks, is essentially a storage account. Let me just find Margie's here. Here's Margie's. So you'll notice that the Margie's container consists of some collateral, Dubai brochure, Las Vegas brochure, some brochures from the Margie's travel organization, right? And also some reviews, where some of the Margie's travel customers have essentially provided some reviews on some of the hotels and some of the accommodation and other travel arrangement that Margie's Travel has actually helped them with. So you'll notice if I crack one of these open, it's effectively going to just be, the Lost City Hotel in Dubai. Very difficult to express how fantastic this place is. By the way, if you specify something like that, the sentiment that comes out of that might actually be negative, right? But again, we've got some skill sets that will bring out that sentiment for you, right? So if you're interested in the sentiment, we've got a custom skill set that will extract the sentiment of the document, right? The sentiment might be positive, the sentiment might be negative. These custom skill sets that I'm referring to, folks, are all basically built on our other AI services. So if I go into the Azure portal here and I find our AI services, oopsie, it's at the back here now. you'll notice here that take a look at the bottom here. These are all our other AI services, right? So you'll see there's things like computer vision, face API, our language service, our speech service, document intelligence, all these other types of AI services that we've got that gives you different AI capabilities. We've got a skill set for almost every one of these, right? So if you want to OCR your image and check what text and store that text somewhere in your index, you can use the computer vision service. It's got a read method. There's actually, you don't really have to actually even integrate like that, right? You can really just use the user skill for that. So you'll notice, and again, we've got some built-in options here, but nothing is stopping you from bringing your own. So I can click on add a skill set, and you'll notice that it's going to give me a very basic sort of skill set there. There's my name of my skill set, reactor. I keep typing it like that. I don't know why. It's probably because it's Friday. But you'll notice on the right-hand side, there's a bunch of them, right? Azure OpenAI embedding. And an embedding is essentially like a vector search, but through OpenAI, right? Custom entity lookup, key phrase extraction, language, merge skill, split skill, PII detection. We want to check to see if there's some PII data in this material. And if there is PII data, maybe we want to redact the information out of the document, right? So all of these things are essentially available. Translation, entity linking, sentiment skills. You will see that we've got there's a bunch of utilities, right? A shaper skill, a document extraction, a conditional skill, loads of these things. You can see vision, image analysis, OCRing, text vectorization, image vectorization, right? All of these different skills. And if these skills don't work for you, of course, you can build your own skill if you wanted to, right? So this framework is actually quite flexible in terms of what we can do. Now, I've already got a couple of skills here. So you'll notice if I go for the Margie's knowledge a skill set, for example, and in fact, let me work through the entire Margie's item for you, right? So I've got a data source called Margie's knowledge data. This is just that storage account I showed you earlier on, right? With those PDFs and reviews and other collateral documents, right? If I go for the Margie's index, you'll notice that the Margie's index is a little bit more comprehensive than the example I showed you earlier on, right? Here you can see that through this Margie's index, I'm actually indexing a variety of information. The metadata language, metadata author, metadata title, locations. Are there any custom locations in this text? Are there any key phrases, language, whatever else I might want? Image tags, image captions, the sentiment, the actual URL of the actual document, right? If that's something that's of importance to me, right? You will notice that once you've got your source and you create your index, that there's some additional capabilities around the index that essentially allows me to further manage and configure the service. You'll see, for example, we've got a search explorer here, and if I just search for London stay, right, it's going to come back with all the documents. There you can see that there's one of the review documents, it looks like, and it says there, great stay. There's going to be London found in that text somewhere, right? So I can use this as a type of a text harness, but you'll also notice that we can also go for a type of JSON view, right? And you can see that this is essentially what some of that might look like. So there's my fields and all their settings. So of course I've got all that source data in the Margie's knowledge base. But that on its own is not going to give me all these fields. I'm not going to get the sentiment from the data itself. So this has to be enriched, and I'll show you in a minute what that's going to look like. I just want to quickly work through these this section. Of course, I can enable things like cores, right? So that so that I don't run into that, cross-site scripting type scenarios where something is blocking my application because it's not from the right URL. Profiles. So you'll notice that from scoring profile perspective, I can give it a name, and then I can say if the location weight is 2, but the key phrases weighting is 5, right? So this gives me the ability to not just assign weights to the different fields that will affect my scoring profile, but you can see that I can also have some functions, right? I can go and average out different fields and say, what is the average? What's the distance between these? What, you'll see that there's a wide variety of additional fields there around the scoring profiles that allows me to affect the results by saying this for us is a little bit more important than this part here. So maybe if I was building some search components and some open AI applications around this knowledge base, I might say that, oh, hang on, if what we want to prioritize is we want to prioritize these and these different items, and this inevitably also affects that result of mine. So you can see you can go and add some of these. And then the last thing I've got here is you'll see that we've also got semantic configurations, right? And with semantic configurations, we can give them a name, and then we can say we want the content field and some additional fields to essentially be. I was going to edit this guy to essentially. Allow things like semantic search, where I'm searching not just for keywords specifically, but where I might be searching for the semantic meaning of different things, right? So I can go and specify that, hang on for a second, I'm going to try to get this information from this output from my indexing process, right? So you can also have some configuration around that. I have to mention, though, that our vector search is an additional component that's got additional cost associated with that. And then there's also some vector profiles that you can actually go and create. Right. So this is what the index looks like. And you'll notice that if I go for fields here, or if I click on edit JSON, you will see that it's essentially got this thing in JSON format. And this is exactly what you can pass straight into the service if you're using the REST API. And then the last thing, if we just backtrack a little bit here, there's my data source now. We've got the data source. There's my index. I've got my index. And then there's the indexer. We've got that as well. However, you'll see that if I go for Margie's indexer, you'll notice that there is an indexer definition. And this definition is essentially got all those different skills I want in there. Right, I've got a better place to show this to you if you'll just give me a second. If I go to my repos here and I go for, 102 examples. So you'll see that what we've got, and I'm going to quickly crack this open with Visual Studio Code here, so you can just get some sort of an indication of what this looks like. But you'll see that there's my data source, right? Very straightforward. Then the connection string and the container that I want to be using, right? And the type is Azure Blob here. You can see that there's my index. I showed this to you early on, very, very similar to the interface I showed you early on. And then there's my indexer. And you'll see that the indexer has got the field mappings where I'm mapping the different fields. And then if I scroll towards the bottom here, you'll see that there's all my source and target fields, right? This is where it's essentially saying there's this indexed field. I'm mapping this to that field, right? It's kind of just proxying between these. And then you'll see from an overall skill set perspective that I can go and add my cognitive services key here. So if I've got something like a multi-service cognitive service account in my Azure environment, I'll pass in that key. And for the rest of these services that make use of our other AI services, it's going to use that cognitive service to essentially get the sentiment, to essentially, recognize the different entities in there. And then towards the bottom here, you will see that there's also a section, and this is an optional section where I've optionally got a knowledge store, right? So I might just index the documents, but if I really want to add some additional metadata, then I can specify a knowledge store here. You'll see it also takes a storage account string, and then it wants to know a storage container, right? And then also some objects, some files, also some tables. So on top of mapping these fields, it's also going to store some of these fields and some of this data in my storage account, and I'll show that to you quickly. If I pop back onto my storage account here and I look at my Margie's. Hey, where's Margie now? Margie, hello. There we go. You can see there's something called Margie's knowledge, right? And you can see from the Margie's knowledge folder, this was essentially generated by the indexer, right? And you'll see field ID. And if I look through this information, you can see file name, that's the file name, and you can see that that's the URL. There's the language, it's English, the sentiment is positive. This information is the result of this skill set checking what the sentiment is, checking what the language is, checking what key phrases are available, right? And when you do a search against the service, this is where this information comes from, right? OpenAI, or let me put it this way, and I think this is important to mention. This service of ours, the search service, is not going to give you the result in terms of OpenAI results, right? It's not going to generate the prompt for you. The OpenAI service will interact with this and will generate the result based on the data. So you can either just search this material and content and get some information back, or you can hook it up to something like an OpenAI service, and OpenAI can then generate prompts based on that, right? Generate your results. So if I ask the OpenAI service, I want to stay in London, it's essentially going to go and look through this index, look through the knowledge base that was created alongside the index, and it's effectively going to say, well, yes, we think it'll be good if you stay in the whatever hotel, because Margie's travel has had customers staying there for some time, and everyone says it's close to water and that it's actually quite safe. All of that information will have been detected by the indexing service, but the additional augmentation of that data is essentially those skill sets that's actually packing that additional metadata around your index. All right, I really hope that makes sense. And then just one last thing quickly, there is a bit of a demo here. Yeah, so if I go for indexers, and this is something that we haven't spoken about, I've got 10 minutes left here. So you'll see that fortunately for me, some of these have failed, right? You can see there's my 102 indexer. It's failed, it hasn't indexed a single document, right? So what went wrong? Well, we've essentially got the ability to debug these, right? It's not a good example. I'll give you another example. If I go for my learn knowledge indexer, right, you will see that there's some of them have had some partial success, but if I look at this one, there's been an error. You can see the skill is deprecated, right? And you can notice that I can actually debug this error or warning. Let me just choose another one that's maybe a little bit more relevant. You can see here that, in fact, I'll choose that top one. and I'll say debug this error or warning. And I want you to notice that it's effectively now showing me, remember I spoke earlier on about the pipeline. It's now basically going to show me the pipeline, right? So I can hit the save button here. It's going to prompt me for the connection string. So let me just get the connection string quickly. I usually use the search debug option, and you can see that I can save this now. And let me just F11 this quickly and just put it in, give you a little bit more space here. And you'll see there that what it's basically doing is it's basically running the session now. But here you will see that we're cracking open the document. If I go to my field mappings, it shows me the field mappings, right? And in fact, if I click on one of these, like OCR, for example, you can see there it's actually generating some warnings, right? But if I click on this warning, for example, you can see there that it's bleating about something here. There's an error warning. Skill input text was too large. It truncated the text. So this shows me immediately now, all right, well, this means I have to do this differently. In fact, in some cases, you might actually see, hang on, it's pointing here to the merged content, but actually what I want is I want to point it to the document body, right? Or the document content for that matter, right? And then I can hit the save button there, test it and check it and see if it works. Yes, it works. Now it's working. And you'll notice that there's an option at the top there that says commit changes. And with commit changes, we will take this new configuration that you've applied on this individual single document, and we will go and apply this now to the base skill set. And this will update that indexer and the skill set. And next time, these sort of errors will go away. And you can troubleshoot and debug these scenarios, right? So there you can see there's the enrichment data structure, and you can see merge content, all of this information. You can get some examples of what these actually look like as well. You can see there's my key phrases, Azure AI solution, whatever the case is. So this debugging interface gives us a great pane of glass on the errors in troubleshooting and debugging and seeing where we can optimize this indexing process. All right. And that, folks, was a very high level jog through the Azure Search service. I was very quick. We only have an hour. We can probably spend a day on this. In our AI 102 course, we actually spend about half a day on this. So just in summary, before we take some questions, we spoke about rich search and indexing. We spoke about enrichment of data. I do want to show you one more thing quickly. Just give me 1 second here, folks. I cannot not do this. There's my index. And you'll see that what they've even done is they've given you like a little, create a little demo app, right? You can see I can enable course. And then I can say, well, give me a demo app and show me the locations there, show me the key phrases, and show me the content there, for example, right? And what this is going to do is it's essentially going to drop a little HTML page in there. It prompted me to enable cores at the beginning, but if I now go search for London stay, then it's going to come back with those results of mine. Right? You can see. Now keep in mind that I think what I did here is I actually said key phrases or something like that, right? And you can see there I can actually go and filter on based on these. So this is a very, very simple example of where we are essentially embedding this search capability straight into a HTML page. And you can see that, hey, as long as we've enabled that course policies, we can really call this Azure Search Service from kind of anywhere, web applications, mobile applications. It's nicely integrated into all of those. All right, and that, folks, is basically a very 1,000-foot view of the Azure Search Service. Don't forget, next week we're going to be back with the final session of this series, where we are going to then take what we learned from the first session about open AI and prompt engineering, and the SDKs and APIs that you interact with those services with, and how we can bring in this search and essentially instruct the OpenAI service to actually use this information in the background from the search index to build out content and material and prompts that's getting returned from the OpenAI service. And other than that, I hope that was worth your time. Let's see if there are any questions. I don't have a question slide here for some weird reason. Any questions?
Yes, Johan, we have one question from Shriyanka. Can we have multiple sources of data ingested in the Azure AI search, like local files and URL together?
Yeah, so you will notice that if you just go in here, so what you'll notice, the answer is kind of yes and no. The OpenAI integration with this allows you to point it to multiple indexes. It's a collection of indexes that you point to. However, when you create one of these indexes, it's essentially when you add one of these data sources, rather, right, you will see that the data source generally has a single connection string. So it might be that you end up having multiple data sources and having multiple indexers and populating the same index. All right, so that is also possible. So yeah, not as I cannot add multiple sources in a single data source, but I hope that answers your question, right? Yes, you can bring multiple data sources together for sure. Okay, I hope that answered your question. If you can give us an indication in the chat if I've answered your question, then happy days. Any further questions? Got about 3 minutes left here, folks. If I check more attributes than necessary in my index fields, would that influence search results negatively? Sorry, just say that. Let me just read that again. If I check multiple attributes, more attributes than necessary in my index fields, would that influence search results? I don't think it'll necessarily. Well, I think it might. I'm not 100% sure. I've not tested that. It's a really, really good question. But the reality is, you might even find. Look, let me put it this way, right? If I've got 20 Word documents, right? I might not have all the metadata across all of these documents, right? Maybe some of that metadata is missing. When the metadata is missing, we simply don't, for that item, populate the property, right? So yes, maybe on the outset it wouldn't have a big effect, but when you do searches against it, yes, the more you pack in there, the more elbow grease the service is going to have and require to actually churn through the results. So I'm not 110% sure, as you can hear, but I suspect that yes, it will essentially affect it in a certain way, especially if some of your items do populate some of those fields. I think if all the fields don't get populated, if there's not one of the index documents populates those properties for you and it stays completely empty, not sure what the result will be of that. But if at least 2 or 3 of them, if some of them are populated, yeah, I suspect that will have an effect on it. But yeah, I'm not 100% sure, as you can actually hear. I would have to go and check that. Any further questions? Okay, so folks, from my side, thank you very much for spending this time with us. I do trust that you've learned a bunch of things. It is exciting material. The reality is it's probably going to become more exciting towards next Friday when we're marrying these two services, because we've touched on the OpenAI service now. We've touched on the search service. Bringing these two together is essentially going to give you that RAG pattern that we're actually all here for. Okay, brilliant. So, ladies and gents, from my side, I think that's it. I hope you've learned as much as possible, and I thank you for your time. And I will chat with you probably in the next week or so. Have a great weekend.